Hello everyone, welcome back to the Anatomy Lab. Today we're going to be taking a look at a specialized type of bone called the vertebra. So the vertebrae are going to be stacked on top of each other to make up something called the vertebral column, which is going to be going along what you think of as your spine, and it is going to be helping to protect your spinal cord as well as supporting your head. So first of all, these are all different types of vertebrae. But there are actually three major types of vertebrae: the cervical vertebra, the thoracic vertebra, as well as the lumbar vertebra. Now, before we could start talking about the types of vertebra, you would likely want to be able to identify its major landmarks. So most of the vertebrae will have certain landmarks, but they will often differ from type to type. So let's actually start off with this one in the middle, which is the thoracic vertebra. So here's the thoracic vertebra. It's a good one to start off with because you can see its features relatively clearly, but there's specific landmarks of this bone that you should be familiar with, as in like landmarks that you should mostly find on each of the types of vertebra. So first, let's identify the big things that stick out. So on the anterior side, you're going to see this large region, this bulky region. This is called the vertebral body. The vertebral body is going to be where you have vertebrae stacking up on top of each other. This is going to allow them to support each other as well as give it a surface that is not like super pointed and easily breakable. So vertebral body, anterior side. Posterior side, this is called the spinous process. So the spinous process, sometimes also called the spine of the vertebra, this is going to be the pointed region on the posterior side. Now, as you go from the spinous process, though, you are also going to see that it is connected to the rest of the vertebra on these larger kind of plate regions. These are called the lamina. So this would be the lamina region. And then it ultimately does connect to the vertebral body, though, via these regions called the pedicles. So spinous process, lamina, pedicle, vertebral body. But that's not all you have here. As you can see, that you have these things that are kind of like poking out from different angles. These that are poking out to the side are called the transverse processes. So these point outwards, and then the ones that point upwards or superiorly are called these superior articular facets. So this is what's going to allow the vertebrae to stack on top of each other, and it is going to then articulate with a facet underneath called the inferior articular facet. So it might be a little bit hard to see these kind of flattened regions that look kind of like depressions. But in any given vertebra, there's also going to be this large hole in the middle. This is called the vertebral canal, the vertebral foramen. So the vertebral foramen is going to be any singular hole, but all together, all of the vertebrae stack, and all of these vertebrae make this long kind of tube-like shape, and that's the vertebral canal. So, now that you know the major landmarks, let's take a look at the types of vertebrae that you have here. So this is going to be a thoracic vertebra, like I said. The major characteristics that you want to look for is that this is going to be kind of the medium-sized vertebra, but also you could look at the vertebral body. It's not too big, it's not too small, but the one that really kind of is obvious or apparent is this right here, the long kind of pointed spinous process. Now, if none of that works, if you cannot figure it out, there is one way that often people use to kind of think of it, at least very generally, and figure out what it might be. So really quickly, try to look at this and squint at it really hard and think, what animal does this remind you of? It has a long kind of pointed nose. It has the kind of horns to the sides as well as the ears going to the top, or maybe those are switched. But if anything, like try to squint at it. Try to really kind of, I don't know, give an ambiguous guess. You might see the giraffe in this case. So thoracic vertebra, if you can see a giraffe, long nose, horns, and ears, that's the thoracic vertebra. So you'll have 12 of these thoracic vertebra. These are going to be the vertebrae which the ribs attach to. And then they're then going to go down to the largest of the vertebrae at the very bottom, the lumbar vertebra. So here's a lumbar vertebra. So make sure that you can identify all of those different landmarks on the lumbar vertebra, but you can go over that on your own. So the lumbar vertebra is going to have all of its major characteristics, just like the thoracic, but the unique characteristics of the lumbar is its large vertebral body. You can see that compared to the thoracic vertebra, it's much smaller. So this one is larger, this is bulkier and stronger. These are at the bottom of the vertebral column, so that, and these need to be big so that they don't break when they're stacked and have pressure being pushed onto them. Another thing that you'll be able to see over here is that the spinous process is not as long and pointed. So compared to the thoracic, it's going to be much shorter and much more rounded. So spinous process is going to be rounder and shorter. But one more way to look at this is, what animal does this look like to you? So this one's a little bit more of a stretch, but squint really hard, especially like this. Fat nose, kind of horned antler, or kind of like antler looking things coming out of it. This is the moose, the big fat nosed moose. So whatever works will work. So I'm not going to judge you if you look for the moose versus the giraffe, but you do also want to try and look for the landmarks so you can be as confident as possible. Now lastly, we have the third type of vertebra called the cervical vertebra. Now this one looks quite different from the other two. This is especially much smaller, like taking a look at its vertebral body, but it also has some very unique characteristics. So one thing that I would like you to take note of really quickly is that these holes are typically not there. These are made because they had a string going through it. But over on the sides, you can see that you have these two holes. These two holes are called the transverse foramina. So the transverse foramina are on these sides over here. These are the unique characteristic of the cervical vertebra. You can see that neither the thoracic nor the lumbar have these holes on the sides. If you find those holes on the sides, you know for sure this is definitely some sort of cervical vertebra. So transverse foramina, those are going to be indicating cervical vertebra. Furthermore, if you look at the spinous process, you can see that it is bifurcated. It has two little points to it. This is another good indicator that this is a cervical vertebra. So these are going to be the vertebrae of your neck. These are going to be at the top of the vertebral column right underneath your skull. But you actually have two specialized cervical vertebrae which are going to have specific names that you need to know as well. So these two. These are the specialized type of vertebrae that are going to be right underneath the skull. These are otherwise known as C1 and C2 and named atlas and axis respectively. So C1, the atlas, you can see here. Notice what is different between the cervical vertebrae and this specific cervical vertebrae. So there isn't really a vertebral body. There isn't really even a spinous process. This is very different from all the vertebrae that you've looked at so far. So this is actually going to be sitting right underneath the skull itself, and it is going to be articulating with the occipital bone of the skull, and it is going to be articulating with the occipital condyles. So those condyles are going to rest right on top of these fossae, the superior articular facets of the atlas. So C1 and now C2. So C2 is right here. C2 has something that is also a little bit different, but maybe you want to look at it from this view to see it more effectively. This is going to be very different from what you see on any other vertebrae. Like where you would typically find the vertebral body, instead you have this little thumb-like projection that is pointing superiorly. This is what's going to allow it to articulate with the atlas so that you can have a little neck rotation and flexibility. So this is the dens C2. This is the axis C2, and this is called the dens of the axis. So one thing that I would like to make clear really quickly is that you need to be able to identify these individually. Like, don't depend on comparison in order for you to figure out which one is which. Look for its major characteristics. Figure out what landmarks are apparent to you. Figure out whether it looks like a giraffe or a moose or otherwise, but you need to be able to identify these by themselves. Alright, so I believe that's it for this video. Good luck with your studying. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.